You are listening to MyHRBuzz, brought to you by MyHRConcierge. Hosted by Chris Cooley, we'll bring you various topics and guests to shed light on the often confusing world of HR and also employee screening. We'll be putting the human in human resources.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think we got a good topic. We're going to hit a hot topic anyway. I've got John Yerger here, which you guys are probably very aware. He's been on the show many times, or the podcast many times. So I appreciate you jumping on, John.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Chris.
Yeah. John is my business partner. I guess we're hitting 16 years.
I think so.
16 years.
Yeah, we're there.
That sounds like me and my wife's conversation about an anniversary. Is it 15? Is it 16? Is it 10?
Yeah, it's the point. You just send flowers and don't worry about it.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well, today we want to talk about, as we're recording, we are about a week from President Trump's second inauguration. And so one of the things that's been a very hot topic is undocumented workers, worksite raids. If you've been listening to the news, Tom Homan's all over the news talking about those things. And so what we wanted to do is spend a little time on how employers can protect themselves from from that if they do have a I-9 audit or something to that effect. And so one of the things, as we go through that, what's as we think about that, what is the importance of just making sure that we're doing our verifying our work authorizations?
Yeah, and we can definitely jump into those tactical kind of fundamental things, Chris. But again, to your point, sort of kicking this off, for those who've kind of followed the news, obviously as you said, we're going into a new administration. Administration we're familiar with because it's been there before. What we want to offer here is not a political or an ideological viewpoint or perspective of that. So it's really taking a more practical approach to immigration. I mean, from what you and I've discussed over many, many years and months, there's so many facets to immigration, naturalization, that you could run down rabbit holes and really it's such a vast and broad area. We want to stay sort of confined in just the basics, kind of getting those things nailed down. Now, to tell our viewers that we think enforcement might be on the rise, we might see more presence as an employer of that enforcement element. I think that's fair to say that's probably likely going into the new administration. We've already seen tones and cues from different news sources that's the intention. And what we find is that instead of focusing on creating new laws for enforcement, there are already existing laws on the books today. These that have been in place for years and years, and we feel that those are the easy glide paths and grease skids for immigration enforcement and for potential more aggressive enforcement to ensure that employers are hiring those individuals who are authorized to work in the U.S. So that's just give it a little more flavor, a little more texture and context of what we want to talk about. But to your question, Chris, on just the basics, how to get started in this thing, it is important. All employers are required to ensure that their employees are authorized to work in the U.S. I mean, that's just part of our responsibility. And what this does is that it protects businesses. It protects you as an employer from potential penalties, fines, civil, and even potentially criminal charges. So, and compliance is an important thing, and we want to foster lawful and a compliant work environment with that.
Yeah, and one thing, as you said, with this new president that's coming in, typically we don't have a history. We can't look back to see what's happened. And so one of the things that we can do is we can look back to his last term and say, well, what happened? What did he do? And so I did a little research and just kind of looking to see how that happened. And if you think about it, there's kind of two different ways that they can do this. They have workplace raids. That's where they pull up in the white vans and they just start shoving people in, right? They check their papers and so forth. The other is what they call the silent raids, and that's where they come in and do an I-9 audit. And that's one way that they check that as well. From a workplace raids perspective, if you look back and we'll just take 2018 as an example, they had some of the highest volume as well as largest detained population that they've had ever. They had, if you look at it, you had here in Mississippi where we are, they raided all the poultry plants. Right. They had over 700 detained people. They had in an electronics refurbisher in Allen, Texas, where they had 284 people arrested.
Yeah.
They did a lot of those, and quite honestly, I don't foresee them raiding 50% of the companies in the country. Right? It's going to be it's more of a deterrent than more than likely they're going to roll into your company with those vans and start, looking.
Yeah.
Quiet raids are a little bit different in that, to your point, it's a process they have. They don't have as much manpower associated with. They're not as costly. Those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at between 2017 and 2019, I-9 audits quadrupled.
Wow.
They went from around 1,300 to almost 6,500 of those in the year, and they were going to grow, and then the pandemic hit in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look back, we know that we can kind of see what's coming. Yeah. All this is going to get really ramped up.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be something that employers need to be wary of, because there are significant penalties as it relates to I-9s, how they're performed, and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And so what are those, as we talk about that, what are those key laws? We talked about, we're going to try to keep this a little bit narrow, just for time and brevity's sake. But what are some of those key laws that that employers need to look at?
Yeah. So to kind of bring this thing back to the basics, right? So the key law really under the USCIS is the Immigration Reform and Control Act, ICRA, IRCA. I'm not saying that right, but anyway, that law is what mandates employers to facilitate the Form I-9. That's part of the onboarding, part of the hiring process that's absolutely required by all employers to complete. And so that law mandates that all employers facilitate that I-9 process. And it's involved. If you haven't done one before, I mean, everyone who's been an employee should have all filled out Section 1, the employee section of an I-9. But as an employer, if you haven't completed an I-9 fully, you need to understand what you're doing. So that's one of the laws that sort of govern that process of ensuring an individual is authorized to work in the U.S. Some cases, E-Verify is available. There's states that either require it and states that permit it. I think it's important for our viewers to check their state laws to make sure that they understand whether E-Verify is a required part of that process or if it's permitted. I think I would encourage, even if it's not required, I would encourage employers to do that. It does provide an additional layer of verification. We'll get into that in a little bit later, but yeah, it does help foster that. And we have to also keep in mind too, it's not an aggressive process or an aggressive action that you undertake with your new employee. I mean, we have to be mindful of potential discrimination. That's one of the things that the federal government is very wary of, is that this verification of an individual's authorization to work in the U.S. could be conceived or perceived as discriminatory. And we got to be careful about that. And there are things to be mindful of when we're doing that we have to be careful that if we have to be consistent. And that's one of the important parts of the I-9 process. You have to do it for all employees. You have to be consistent with it.
Yeah. And, one of the things I was reading, and I read and to your point, it's something that is involved. It's something that it can be complicated. I read a stat, and it said that 76%, I think this was according to government stats, 76% of all I-9s have at least one error.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. That may be a low.
So yeah, it is definitely something that employers have to be aware of and have to, something they really need to do. And so as part of that, obviously you talked about doing the I-9, the e-verification. One big part of that is IDs.
Yeah.
What happens if you think you've got a fraudulent document?
So yes, the individual's required to provide documents that are acceptable as part of the list of acceptable documents in the Form I-9. And those list documents, those acceptable documents, are part of the instruction set that's within the Form I-9. So employers should be able to read that, understand those instructions as to what is an acceptable document, a list A or a list B and list C document. So again, if you haven't really spent a lot of time dealing with Form I-9s, I encourage your viewers to really pay attention to those instructions and understand what is acceptable with that. Now, we have to look at those documents, Chris, and we're not forensic scientists. We're not forensic agents, where we can, read signatures and determine whether they're authentic or not, or look at the bend of an ID card and say, well, was that manipulated? Was that did somebody alter this document? We can't do that. We have to take reasonable efforts as employers to determine the authenticity and the genuineness of that document related to what the individual is presenting to us. So that's what we have to do, is make reasonable good faith. And we'll talk about good faith throughout our discussion today, because that's really incumbent on us to make those good faith efforts throughout. And again, E-Verify, is just that additional layer, electronic verification. When employers use the E-Verify process, they're entering that document information into that database, and it goes out and pings that record, and it will respond back to that employer if that individual is authorized to work in the U.S. It'll give a confirmation and a confirmation code number, and we hope that employers are keeping those records as well, that they took that additional step and have that certification number, that confirmation number. So these are the practices that we think could help avoid fraud. We can't always know. We take our best efforts, our good faith efforts, but if we do think that we've been presented fraudulent documents, that's when you get legal counsel involved, and maybe even the necessary authorities under immigration, Homeland Security, or U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Those websites, USCIS.gov or DHS.gov, are both available. They have numbers you can call to get assistance if you feel that you've been presented fraudulent documents. And in that case, you have to determine, you got to be careful though. You determine whether or not to terminate that hiring process, that employment process with that individual. But again, we have to be careful not to be discriminatory. And that's why you want an expert, perhaps legal counsel, involved in those situations.
Okay. No, and I think that makes sense, because that is such a slippery slope. And I do know on the Department of Labor website, they do have instructions for I-9s. And in some of they have one that's pretty comprehensive, and it will show you examples of different cards, different documents. So that can help as well. But to your point, if they've got a really good printer, if they, if they either, if it was stolen or they created it themselves, it's tough.
Yeah. And if we believe what we see and believe what we think we know when it comes to the influx of immigration into our borders over the past many years, we're going to see an increase in individuals looking for work, that foreign nationals, and that's good. I mean, if they are authorized to work in the U.S. and are employable, that's a good thing. We want that, but we just have to be careful, because the sophistication of altered documents, sophistication of creating false IDs is getting so refined, and I would imagine that there are players out there who have really dialed that in and understand that, and so that makes our job as employers even more difficult.
Yeah. And so as we're going through these I-9s, we're getting our documents. What are common mistakes? So we're going through the I-9s. We're having the employee fill them out. What are typical mistakes in that process?
Yeah, the biggest one, Chris, and it's perplexing. It's hard to, and maybe it's easy to understand, is just getting them done on time.
Yeah.
Those I-9 forms have to be fully completed, signed, and executed within 3 days of the employee's first date of employment. And I know as employers, we have so many other balls in the air that we have to juggle, things that we have to do. And sometimes we just don't get that done within that 3-day period. You think 3 days is plenty of time. And in the work world, I mean, it's a blink. And so we see too many instances where that's the case, where they don't get those forms completed within that 3-day required period. That's an infraction. That's a compliance violation, plain and simple. And we'll get into the penalties and how much financial penalty the employer can be burdened with by not being compliant. So it's important to get that done. The other is really not understanding what the employer's role is when it comes to how and what documents are presented by the employee. The employer cannot dictate to that employee which documents they want to have as part of that verification process. So that's important to understand that you can't say, no, I don't want your passport. I need to see your social security card and I need to see your driver's license. Had a situation come up recently where an employee was being onboarded and they presented a birth certificate as opposed to a social security card for purposes of a List C identification. So they had a driver's license and a birth certificate, which are acceptable List B and C documents that an individual can present as verification of their identification. The employer wanted the social security card. And I said, well, you can't request that.
Right.
It's illegal for you to request or even ask for that social security card. And she said, but I need it for payroll. I said, that's fine. I said, complete the I-9 process with the documents that were presented to you in the context of verifying for employee I-9 employment purposes. But once you complete that process, then you can move on to the discussion of payroll. And that you need a certain document for payroll purposes, not for I-9, but simply for payroll. And they would, and you can require that Social Security for verification purposes for tax related purposes under the IRS rules and laws. That's okay. That's acceptable. But don't conflate or intersect that with the I-9 process, because then you get into an area where that's a violation and that's discriminatory and it's illegal to ask for that. So I know that's like parsing and it's very fine language between the two, but making that distinction is important.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon for employers to go, hey, bring your social security card and your driver's license.
Yeah.
When you show up for work.
Yeah, and well, I have a passport. No, I need your driver's license, Social Security. You're not able to, and not legally can you ask for that. Other violations are for those individuals who have a resident alien card or some sort of temporary work permit. When those expire, they have to be re-verified. There's a re-verification section in the employer side of the I-9. So be aware of the expiration of those work permits. It's not the same as a driver's license. Okay, that's different. These work authorizations are generally for foreign nationals who have a work permit, USCIS resident alien card, green card, H-1B visa card. So those will expire, and you have to make sure that you re-verify that on the Form I-9. And then the other kind of common mistake is, again, unintentionally, I'm sure nobody wants to discriminate when they're hiring an onboarding employee, but you can unintentionally discriminate. So you have to be really careful when you're going through that process that you don't discriminate based on citizenship or national origin.
Yeah, and to your point, I know I've gotten questions about the driver's license, so that's a good point because I think a lot of people confuse that. They think any document that's presented that has an expiration has to be re-verified.
That's right.
But a driver's license doesn't. And really, I get it. And I think, I mean, if to me that would be a point of emphasis on an I-9 audit, because if you're trying to get workers that are not able to work in the U.S., a lot of times what will happen is they'll get that work permit, it runs out, they don't renew it. Yeah. But as long as they don't move jobs, they've got a job if you're not reviewing that, if that makes sense. So it's a way to stay, you know?
It's easy to let those slip by you if you're not on top of it and have good controls to maintain that. And then if you do have a subsequent audit, then you're going to fail that one if it's not re-verified. And again, we're talking about penalties, penalties. And I'm not going to say criminal charges can be levied, civil charges, but again, when we get into areas of discrimination and protected classes, that's an area we don't want to find ourselves in as employers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we've got these. How do we stay out of these? How do we mitigate these problems?
Well, I mean, there are things that we can avoid, as the potential pitfalls as employers. Train your staff, whoever your HR professional is, whoever's responsible in your organization for onboarding and hiring. Train them on that process. Have them go through training. There's certainly available training materials that are out there that employers can provide. You mentioned the documents that are in the Department of Labor DOL.gov site under I-9 immigration. There's a plethora of tools, resources, training guides, information that an individual can use to help keep them abreast of what's going on. USCIS.gov, again, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services site is a good one. Department of Homeland Security, you can sign up for their alerts. They do have a push alert that will push information to you that you can consume that would help you stay abreast of all that's required. So training's important. Also, go ahead and we're at the beginning of a new year, and if time permits, right now it's a good time, and maybe even annually, conduct an internal audit. Go through your current I-9. We'll talk a little bit about what you can do if you find an error, incorrect information, or an incomplete section of an I-9. We'll talk about sort of what you can do in those cases. But those are things that are important. And again, I mentioned earlier, E-Verify is not difficult. It's an easy additional step in the onboarding. It takes seconds to process. Having that additional verification that individual and the documents that were presented to you are authentic and genuine and do represent the identification of that individual gives you assurance as an employer, that extra assurance. So I would encourage that, particularly with what you in setting this conversation up today, Chris, of what we can expect over the next administration. Next year, we feel enforcement will continue to tick up significantly.
Yeah, and at least with the E-Verify, it just showed, to your point, it's the extra step of I tried. I did the I-9, I did the E-Verify. I don't know what else I could do.
That's right. And that's that good faith provision that we as employers we're bound to do that, and that and making sure that we're not discriminating. That's the balance.
Yeah. So as we go through this process, kind of walking through, what happens if we hire somebody that we've done all these things, we hire them that's an undocumented worker. Either we know it, or we just make an honest mistake. So what do we do there?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One is if you use E-Verify, I want to talk about that process. What happens if you do E-Verify an individual and you don't get that immediate response from that system that individual is authorized to work in the U.S. You get what they call a tentative non-confirmation, or a TNC. There's a very specific process, an appeals process, an administrative process that individual has the right to in order to remedy and to correct whatever. Maybe there's an error in the system that or something that's incomplete in their and whatever was set up to provision their identification to authorize them to work in the U.S. So they have 8 days to contest from that date that you run that tentative non-confirmation. That means that they have the opportunity, and you can provide them instructions to discuss that with their local Social Security Administration office. That's the place where they would start that appeal process. And then after that, they have 40 days for the process to be able to come back and present either the correct form of identification or a valid form of identification. So that's what, under that E-Verify process, there is an appeals process and a certain administrative time frame of which that can be resolved. Without E-Verify, and you're just relying on the documents, and you're not sure, again, that's where I think get guidance from a legal professional as to how to move through that process. And they will help you get in touch with the right administrative resources within the federal government to determine whether or not that individual can move forward, that is authorized or not. And if not, again, you can at that point move to end that employment process with that individual. But be careful and don't be too reactionary in that, because again, if we don't do it the right way, then it could lead to a potential discrimination charge. You don't want to have to go through a civil proceeding to defend that.
Right. And one thing, as you said, an E-Verify takes seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's free.
That's right.
So you can go and you can do that free. So it's kind of, I've always thought it was a no-brainer.
Yeah.
It's just an extra step to protect your company.
That's exactly right. And that's what this is about, is protecting you from financial risk. And there's significant financial risk, and we can talk about that here. I think we've got that coming up. So.
Yeah. And so that's a good segue. So we've talked about this, why it's important. They're coming in, they're doing these raids, they're doing these I-9 audits. Why do we care? What if they catch us? What's it going to cost? What is that downside to if it occurs?
Yeah. So first offense at minimum, an I-9 error or omission of information or error in mistake on the form, maybe that's a couple $100 to start, but that can go up to $13,000 if repeated violations, second, third violations. So we're talking about a broad range of penalties up to the tens of thousands of dollars just for incorrect I-9s, non-compliant on that form. And that's per violation. And there can be multiple violations on a single form. So it's not just that you have 10 errors, or let me back. That's a bit extreme. Let's say that you have 3 errors and the penalty is $10,000 per error. That's $30,000 in penalties against the employer. And Chris, this doesn't fall under EPLI or employee liability protection, practice liability. This comes out of your bottom line. This is not an insurable risk. This is employer risk all the way. So you have to be mindful of that. Now, the other part of this too is that if you knowingly and continuously hire individuals that are not authorized to work in the U.S., you can be fined up to $25,000 per unauthorized employee. So they mean for these penalties to hurt, and they're serious about the enforcement of them. And there can be civil charges and also potential criminal charges as well. And I know that you cited a couple of instances where some processing plants here in the state of Mississippi, criminal charges were filed, and the executives and HR department head went to jail.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not something that you would want to take lightly. I can assure you from all of what we've seen and read and understand about what's coming up in the next administration, to try to really get a handle on this, however you want to frame it, the immigration issues that we have right now in this country. That's going to be one of the first places to go to, is the employers, to really try to get a handle on this thing. So I think
Yeah.
it's important for our employers to really, really take heed and be prepared and start preparing now.
Yeah, and I think the thought of that is the administration, if we go after the employers are less apt, they're going to be more careful and less apt to hire undocumented workers. Therefore, there's no jobs. And then therefore it's a way to maybe have them go back, So
Yeah.
and I get it. I think that's the plan. And I mean, I know we had this was what, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we did a convention. We spoke at a convention, and we were talking about this. We're talking about I-9s.
Yeah.
And, we're talking, and we get up, we do our spill. And after the spill, we're out talking in the lobby, and this guy walks up, and he said, he's like, y'all did a good job. And I thank you. And he said, yeah, but y'all just couldn't answer my question. And we said, what's your question? And, how can we help? And he goes, well, I've got, and I think he had a restaurant. And he said, I've got a restaurant, and I've got, I forget the number. It's like 10 undocumented workers that work for me. Like, okay, so what's your question? He said, I wanted y'all to tell me how I can keep them employed without having to worry about any of this other stuff. He goes, they live in my attic, and I know where all the checkpoints are, so we drive around the checkpoints. And at that time, me and John both start just backing up. It's like the Homer Simpson gif, going into the bushes. We just start backing up, and it's like, I don't know if we can help you with that.
No.
I don't know if we can make you compliant with that.
No, we totally melted into the bush at that point, because it didn't feel like our job was to help them try to find ways to circumvent the law. That's not
right.
And not what and again, it struck me, and I know it struck Chris. It's like, this is just the wrong-headed way of looking at this. The first thing you should have done is follow the law. Right now, we're not in a position to offer you any guidance. There's just no way situation. So again, my hope is that everybody take another look at this thing, and more discernment and more clear heads, because enforcement is going to continue to increase significantly. I've said that repeatedly, but that's just the fact. We know that. There's not been any ambiguity coming from the incoming administration about it whatsoever. I don't take that as a bluff, or I would not think that that's just a political posture. That's a real situation. So
I think so. I agree with you. And so what do we do? I mean, we've talked about raids, we've talked about these things. How do we get ready? What do we do? How do we go through and check our I-9s?
Yeah. So again, it's about maintaining that good faith, and compliance is key to that. And what we want to do is just do what we can as employers to mitigate as much as possible any of the risk associated with this. Go to work now, schedule some time, carve out time to begin that process, and do your audit. Go through your current I-9 process. And I'll say something else about I-9s. When we do our HR health check assessments with our clients, and to kind of look at their practices and bring in recommendations, one of the recommendations we always bring to the table is filing your I-9 forms separately from your personnel files. And I get a sort of a quizzical look and response from a lot of employers when I suggest that. Is why would I do that? And part of the reason is, if you are subjected to an audit, and I've had it happen to me where an agent walks in the door unannounced, flashes his badge, and says, I need to see your Form I-9s. At that point, that's a federal agent, and that's a legal request, and you are to comply with that request. And so having them in a separate file provides that agent only the Form I-9s. If those I-9s are in a personnel file that may have tons of other documents, several other documents. Anything in that file could be subject to audit, review, scrutiny. And the purview doesn't have to just be I-9. It could be anything under the Department of Labor purview, even wage and hour. So they could look at W-4s, they could look at state tax form, they could look at a number of documents to determine in those files to determine if there are any potential infractions. So you want to, again, that's another way to mitigate risk is let's just get those I-9s in a separate file. And that way, if they need to audit you or you are subject to an audit, then that's all they have access to, period. So that's kind of the first thing we want to do is do that process. Now, what happens? This is important. So what if we find I-9 forms that are incorrect or incomplete? How do we make corrections? How do we fill in missing information? And there's a very specific way that Homeland Security requires you to do that. Don't use whiteout. Don't shred that form and have the employee fill out a new one. You can't do that. What you have to do in situations where you review that I-9 form and there's incorrect information, let's say it's the incorrect social security number or date of birth. If it's the employee section and the employee is still employed by you, they are responsible for making the corrections on section 1 of the form I-9. And if the date of birth is incorrect, you simply just draw a line through that field, that information, that record, that date of birth that's incorrect, and either above it or beside it, write the correct date, and that employee's to initial that. So make the correction and initial. Employee does section 1, the employer section is section 2, kind of the second page of the form I-9. If we have an error there, the employer is responsible for drawing a line through the incorrect information, writing in the correct and initial. So that's corrections. So it's important to follow that process. The other is if there's missing information in sections. Get that information in those sections as soon as possible. And then in the I-9, there's a box down below that section called additional information. It's just a box field. And you as an employer to write in there the reason that was delayed, why, what happened that this information was delayed because of whatever reason. It has been updated on this date, and you sign in that additional information box. So that'll address and provide good faith efforts to correct and to complete. Now, will they still ding you on that? I don't know. I can't say they won't. But again, what you've done is demonstrated that good faith effort to say, look, we audited, we found these mistakes, we found these omissions, and we corrected them, we added the information, and we followed your instructions to the T. So that's important to follow that very rigor when you're dealing with those types of situations. Don't alter historical records. Don't backdate. Don't do anything, cute or clever, because they'll know. They know every trick in the book. So don't try to be too clever with that process. Just do it the right way, and then just continuously, at least annually, audit your I-9s. Just make sure that everything's clean and up to speed on that. And again, if they're late completions 3 days after 3-day requirement, again, you'll still want to put in the additional information box why it was late, why it didn't get signed within 3 days.
Now, how long do we have to keep it?
So it's a good question. We get that a good bit, and that's also part of our service to our clients and our initial implementation service orientation. We talk about file retention. And I-9s, for example, as long as that employee is an active employee, that I-9 stays with that employee and it's an active record. Okay, and you maintain that in an I-9 file. Upon termination, you can purge, shred, properly destroy that document either 1 year after termination or 3 years from date of hire, whichever is longer. And I'll say that again, it's 1 year after termination or 3 years after date of hire. So look at that when you're thinking about purging old I-9s from employees that no longer work for you, there's no reason for you to keep boxes and stacks of I-9s for employees who haven't worked for you for 4, 5, 10 years. So you can go through that process and properly shred and properly dispose of those documents based on that time frame.
Yeah, and I think that's important because what you don't want to do is if you have an audit come in, you don't want to get dinged on I-9s that really you could have purged.
Gosh, no, man. Employees that don't work there, you can't get them corrected properly. You're going to get dinged. You're going to get hit with those. They're not going to show any mercy on that. So that's a really good point, Chris. So that's, again, part of this risk mitigation, which is why we're here today to talk.
Yeah.
And talk to our listeners about what can we do to get compliant to, well, number one, mitigate that risk and exposure to costly penalties. Not only does it, if you get hit like that, if you get really in a bad situation, not only do you get financially dinged, your reputation as an employer can be affected. Pretty much every single day for many weeks after these raids that occurred and employers were hit with these raids and audits, the media picks up some of that. And some of that can get out in public, and it creates a perception that you don't want as an employer. So that's important. And then the other part of that too, and I've mentioned it a number of times, but I can't emphasize it enough, is the unintended discrimination. You don't intentionally go into this with to discriminate against your employees, regardless of citizenship, national origin, race, any of the above protected classes. But in this case, if you do, after all the penalties that are levied by the agencies, you may find yourself in a civil court, fighting a discrimination lawsuit, and then that could become extremely costly for you as well.
Yeah, and these are just so important, these I-9s, and I know a lot of times they get overlooked, right? They're just another document. Let's just get them to sign it and let's move on.
Yep.
But there are real repercussions if you don't do them correctly.
That's right.
And I think that's a lot of great information on how to do that. One, how to do it how to get them right. And then two, if they're not right, how to fix them.
Yep, exactly.
And so I think that's a lot of great information. Is there anything else that you can think of that you kind of wanted to address while we're here?
I got to talk about culture a little bit too, because it matters. When we talk about why this is important, there's the real risk, there's the real nuts and bolts. I think we've established that today. But what does compliance mean in terms of fostering a culture within the workplace? And compliance and following rules matter. And when your staff and your employees see that it matters to you as an employer, and you follow those rules and you follow the guidelines and you operate a compliant workplace, that gives them confidence and security in that. And then secondly, it establishes an ethos within that culture that rules are to be followed. And it doesn't matter whether it's an I-9 immigration or a company policy. All have the same weight in terms of the importance. And so when we do that, again, having rules and regulations and having policies and procedures within an organization are not punitive, onerous requirements. They foster a healthy culture, a healthy expectation of what's expected. And so that really is important too. I don't want to minimize that, but and certainly give some air to that as well when we think about what this means to us as employers. So I just wanted to toss that out there as part of the effort too.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that's a great point. And I really appreciate you joining us today. I think it's a hot topic. I think it's something that all employers really need to address, make sure they've got everything taken care of, make sure they're in good shape. And I think that was a lot of great information for them. So I appreciate it.
Good. It's my pleasure. I hope it was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate everybody that listened today. And we'll definitely hope you stick with us, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to the MyHRBuzz podcast presented by MyHRConcierge. For more information on this topic and many others, please visit our blog at www.myhrbuzz.com. It's a free resource and has a lot of great information on HR and employee screening related topics. If you like the podcast, please do 3 things for us. 1, leave a review. 2, subscribe to the podcast. And 3, tell a friend. Our podcasts are available on iTunes, Spotify, and many other places where you get your favorite podcasts. If you'd like to provide ideas or feedback on future shows, send us an email at podcast@myhrbuzz.com, or you can reach us at 855-538-6947, extension 108. This is Chris Cooley with MyHRConcierge. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to sharing more topics with you in the future.